It sounds like though Palantir, right? It might like replace some people's jobs. Do you think like that would like as far as like certain managers in these companies, they'll probably be hesitant to bring in Palantir if Palantir can probably replace some of those positions or the redundant positions. Is that you think that's something that'll happen and will probably prevent some managers or CEOs from bringing in Palantir?
Not really. So they've done a bad job of communicating this, but Karp has said in many interviews his job is not to automate the world with Palantir. His job is
Okay.
to make sure the humans that are using Palantir have a better understanding of what they're doing. So you always need a human to understand the data and then make the decision. Like the software is not going to just like make a decision for you, because decisions that are made in companies ultimately have huge consequences and ramifications. The software is there to help someone who is either technical, non-technical, manager, C-suite, whatever, to be able to understand what to do at a faster rate, at a more efficient rate. So a manager right now is not going to look at 40 million pieces of data and be able to make a decision, because they can't do
Yeah.
that. Or if they try to do that, they're going to make a shitty decision. So to me,
Yeah.
the sell on Palantir is we integrate with your company. We don't take away jobs. And Karp really hates the idea of people losing their jobs because he hates Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is all about optimized
Yeah.
productivity and automation. And he's like, no, fuck that. There's real people that we need to like care about. So instead of that, I think it's very much less about automating jobs, more so just getting people to understand what to do with the vast amount of data that they have. And this only makes sense in a world like this company only becomes a big company in a world or in a future world in which every single organization on the planet has massive amounts of data and they need to understand what to do with it. And if we believe that if all this data is ultimately going to be relevant to companies to try to make sense of, then if there is a software that can do that, you're talking about something that is instant access into every industry and every sector of the economy if they can scale at the end of the day.
But it sound like so. I mean, certain things they're already major companies leading in for example, the CRM, right? If they
Mhm.
want to infiltrate the CRM, there's already Salesforce and big companies. Like, how do they compete with companies that specialize in certain things in businesses? Like what would they do for that?
I think the key is they don't compete, right? They don't do what traditional big companies are doing. So they're not trying to compete with the Salesforce. They're not trying to be a CRM. They're trying to do a very specific task within an organization, which is not manage your leads, your pipeline, your prospect, all that stuff, or do traditional business messaging communications like Slack. I mean, they're trying to say you have massive amounts of data, and we have
Yeah.
predictive models built upon 17 years of building out this software that can more effectively and efficiently tell you what to do with that data instantly. Now, Salesforce is something of a platform that might be able to do that. It's just then becomes a question of the data, right? There are other search engines other than Google, but Google has the particular types of data and
Right.
algorithms that allow us to use them more. So I think at that point, they're truly not competing with a lot of people. I mean, a lot of the other software companies like the Snowflakes and Databricks of the world, they're not doing the specific edge cases that Palantir is doing, even if there's some overlaps. And because of that, that's where the opportunity is. Oh, am I buying a Tesla in 2017? Right? Am I actually buying
Yeah.
something that could be a monopoly
You
in this space?
you mentioned Snowflake, and I feel like that's the closest competitor. What would you say is the closest competitor? I mean, because they feel like I feel like they're extremely unique. But if you had to say this is their competitor, would you say Snowflake, or is there anyone else you have in mind?
No, I mean, like again, from the research I've done, companies are not choosing between Snowflake and Palantir. They either don't want Palantir because they don't see the value prop, or they think it's too expensive, or they don't want to integrate it, or they're choosing Palantir. So I don't think there's a true competitor. I did a video that I think the only true competitor is companies feeling that they have enough internal technical people to be able to make sense of the data that they have, and they don't need a full integration with an external piece of software. And that comes down to sales and marketing. So Palantir just has to do a good job selling it. But I don't really think there is a competitor right now.
Okay, so Palantir they've purchased quite a few SPACs, and it seems like SPACs that are related to what they're doing in their field with information. What would you say are your most bullish SPACs, like the SPACs that have the most prospect? And what do you think was kind of like a waste of money that you think is not going to pan out? You have anything like that, or
So I think Wejo is the most bullish SPAC that I am on. So
okay,
their SPAC strategy is let's put money into companies and gain an equity stake that are only going to be successful if they learn how to optimize their data. So it's a really, if you believe in Cathie Wood and disruptive innovation, it's a cool strategy because they're betting on the future potential of a company that has massive amounts of oil, i.e. data, in a specific niche. So Wejo is specific for big data, for cars and AI
yeah,
and autonomous vehicles and all that stuff. So they're betting that, look, you're not only going to use our software, so they're gaining a customer in these SPACs, but we're going to get to own a part of you if by using our software, which we already know is best in class, and you guys can just execute over the next 5-10 years, you're going to build a massive company on the backs of data in the specific niche that you're in. So I think Wejo is one of those things, because that could be, even if it gets to 1/10 of what a Tesla is in terms of car data, that's a multi-$100 billion company, which I think it would be really cool. I think the one that I'm the least bullish on is this biotech they invested in called Cellularity. And that's only because I've had experiences with biotechs where either the drug works or it doesn't. So that was one that was interesting. It's like that company is using data, but I'm like, at the end of the day, like the risk is mitigated because you have so much data that the potential for the drug to fail is lower than it would be because you've optimized the way you make the drug because of all this data. But if it fails, and all the money's gone. So I guess we'll see what happens.
Well, talking about healthcare, I know Palantir is involved in healthcare. How are they exactly directly or indirectly involved in healthcare? What do they do with healthcare?
Yeah, and this is actually to go back to one of your early questions of how do you do research. I think one of the things that made me a little bit different when it came to the Palantir content was I started going back into the history of the company and going through their website and being like, what do they actually offer? Because again, it's such a complex company, and like people are like, oh, they're data analytics, but it's like, okay, what does that mean? And then you go through their website, and there's all these offerings. There's like crypto, healthcare, blockchain, blah, blah, blah. And you click on them and you start reading. It takes a long time to read and process it. And then you start to understand. So with healthcare, they try to work with hospitals, drug discovery companies, et cetera, to implement their software so that all of the data that hospitals have or drug companies have can come into a centralized place. And then whatever tasks the hospital wants to do, let's say optimize for certain patients in a certain part of the hospital. For drug discovery companies, obviously R&D to find better ways to make their drugs more effective. It uses its software again as like a Google search function to figure out how to do something within the company that they want to do with the data that they have and with the data that they're going to get. So if we believe that healthcare is going to become more and more important, and we believe that distribution of particular drugs is going to become more and more important, then we have to believe that there's a software that is going to be able to manage that, because it's not going to be done by itself. COVID was the biggest, use case for me. Like when COVID happened, I mean, Palantir, I'm doing a video on this. They were central to almost every single government in Europe and the United States that was distributing the vaccine, right? So like, I mean, if a pandemic were to ever happen again, or something that were ever to happen where the health industry gets flipped upside down, if you've got technology on your side, you're talking about millions of lives that could be saved.
So, I mean, like a follow-up question to the healthcare is like, that sounds good in theory, right? If all the hospitals, if we can all share information, it's going to be better outcomes for the patient. But that sounds good in theory. How practical is it? I mean, because usually it takes a catastrophe. I mean, even like the government, like after 9/11, finally, like the fire department would communicate with police, and there was a centralized communication. But it took a major event. And so how would they integrate that with healthcare? Because there's private hospitals, public hospitals. Are they willing to work together, or is that too much of a general question?
Well, I mean, I think eventually, if more and more hospitals, companies, NGOs, whatever, want to become more effective at what they're doing, they're going to have to realize that technology is the basis by which they get to that comfort. And again, this is the sort of the disruptive innovation thesis. If you believe in the next 10 years that every organization is going to need to be more efficient and effective, because if that hospital can't do the right thing quicker than the hospital down the street, I mean, they're just going to lose business. It's very simple. Like I go to a chiropractor because my back is not that well. And, one day they sent me some bill for like $200, and I started calling the competitors chiropractors because I was like, this is stupid. Like, why would I like it was some weird mix up in the bill. I just didn't feel like paying the $200. They told me I didn't have to pay it, and they called me right then and that day and said, oh, you don't have to pay this $200. That was just a mistake. Like these things, it's hard for these businesses to make money. They really depend on making sure you stay as a client so that they can bill the crap out of your insurance. And if they don't have technology ultimately at the end of the day to optimize that stuff, if their competitors do, then their competitors are just going to get ahead. So in theory, yes, you're definitely correct. I just do think in the next 5-10 years, if every organization wants to survive, they're going to have to be able to use some centralized form of technology to make things faster and efficient. Because instead of 2-day shipping, we're going to want 2-hour shipping, right? Consumers are not going to want things that take time. So if that's the case,
that's a great point. So with the practical aspect of how do they make money, can you talk about, for example, they got the FAA contract. How does that look financially per year? How much work do they have to actually put? Like how much money does it cost for them to make whatever contract money they make? Like, how much do they keep of that net wise? And so that, just to get an idea of how they're going to be profitable in other sectors.
So they usually, so in terms of when they onboard a client, they usually have 3 steps. They first introduce them to the software. They let them use the software. The second step is scaling them up to integrating the software in their organization as a trial run. And they're not making any money at this stage. And the third step is when they actually sell them and they're like, hey, do you want it or not? Like, do you see the value of it? And I think that's a strong strategy. Now you're spending the first 2 steps, which may take a couple of months of getting them to really care about the product. But the average revenue they have per client per contract is about 8.1 million, which is ridiculous, right? They just got 116 million from the US Army yesterday in a press release. So it's like when you have contracts that are ranging at $100 million per and 8 million average, then you really got to get integrated with the customer in order for them to be able to see the value proposition. And when you get them, the business model is sticky enough for customers to not leave, as we've seen with the retention rate, which is pretty strong. I think they're doing it about 77% gross margin on a lot of these deals, which is high for a SaaS business. And that makes sense. They're a SaaS business. You build the software once, you don't have to worry about it. But I think it's just a question of getting people into the door. And the problem is right now getting more people into the door. And it's not really a problem, but in terms of Wall Street and what they want to see happen, it is a problem because it's not enough. So if they get people into the door and those people start liking the software, then there's a chance for them to get them as clients.
Yeah, I think the Wall Street narrative, they have a few points, and I think a lot of them been easily debunked. But they talk about information and what they do with the information. They talk about the case in Europe with the lawsuit in Europe against them, and they also mention like government austerity. Like if the government has to cut back and Palantir's depending on the contracts because the majority of their contracts are government, how are they going to survive? Losing these government contracts if it ever happened. What do you say to a few of those points?
How would they survive if they lost a governmental contract?
Well, this is like the kind of like the Wall Street narrative, right? Like the people that are bearish against Palantir. They mention information and the lawsuit in Europe and government austerity. Like if the government cut back, will it affect Palantir?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely would affect Palantir if the government stopped paying them. I think, but they have a buffer for them. So, like for example, like the first response is I don't think the government's going to cut back because the software is useful. Like at the end of the day, it's binary. Space Systems Command just gave them $43 million in June. The Nuclear National Administration gave them $90 million.